Recently, a series of moves by the Trump administration have been particularly intriguing. This includes Deputy Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth's unusually strong warning to the Chinese Communist Party CCP, Trump's post about China's internal turmoil, and his expressed desire to speak directly with Xi Jinping. What's truly happening behind the scenes? Adding to this mystery, the sudden death of Su Keiliang, former vice chairman of China's Central Military Commission, casts an even more unsettling shadow over the current situation in China. On Saturday, May 31st, the annual Shangri-La Dialogue took place in Singapore. This yearly forum is jointly organized by the International Institute for Strategic Studies IISS and the Singapore Ministry of Defense's Asian Security Summit Office. The US Deputy Secretary of Defense delivered an approximately one-hour keynote address. Hegseth stated that as European allies begin to increase their investment and strengthen their own security capabilities, the United States can focus more on the Indo-Pacific region. He explicitly called the Taiwan Strait and the South China Sea region the priority theater for the US in the Indo-Pacific. He emphasized that the prosperity and security of the American people are inextricably linked to the prosperity and security of the people in that region, affirming that the United States will remain here. This statement was clearly directed at China. Beijing claims sovereignty over more than 80% of the South China Sea based on a vaguely marked dashed line map from 1947, known as the Nine-Dash Line. However, the Philippines, Vietnam, Brunei, and Malaysia refute this claim. In 2016, an international tribunal ruled that China's extensive claim lacked legal basis, but Beijing refused to accept the ruling. Hegseth further noted, "In fact, we are here this morning, and some are not," which was also a veiled reference to China. In previous years, China's Minister of National Defense typically attended the Shangri-La Dialogue. However, this year, Chinese Defense Minister Dong Jun was absent, and Beijing didn't even send a high-ranking general or admiral. Dong Chun's absence could be related to internal power struggles within the CCP and a weakening of Xi Jinping's authority. Dong Jun is a trusted confidant of Xi Jinping, having been promoted to defense minister by Xi in December 2023. Dong Jun was reportedly recommended to Xi Jinping by Miao Hua, director of the Central Military Commission's Political Work Department, who is Xi's chief confidant in the military and a Fujian faction general promoted by Xi. However, in December 2024, Miao Hua fell from grace. Political observers analyze that John Yuxia, vice chairman of the Central Military Commission, orchestrated Miao Hua's downfall. In April of this year, Miao Hua was stripped of his National People's Congress delegate status. On May 31st, Miao Hua's name disappeared from the list of Central Military Commission members on the Chinese Ministry of National Defense website. While Dong Jun still participates in some domestic activities, he has been notably absent from important meetings. At the Shangri-La Dialogue, Hegseth warned that the CCP seeks to become the hegemon of Asia, attempting to dominate and control the entire region through massive military expansion and a willingness to use military force. China wants to fundamentally change the status quo in the region. Hegseth stated, "We cannot turn a blind eye to this." He emphasized that any attempt by Communist China to conquer Taiwan by force will have devastating consequences for the Indo-Pacific region and indeed for the entire world. He stressed, "There is no reason to ignore it. The threat posed by China is real and potentially imminent." Hegseth also warned that Xi Jinping has ordered the PLO to be ready to invade Taiwan by 2027, and it could even happen sooner. Hegseth underscored, "We have no intention of conflict with Communist China. We will not incite, nor will we try to conquer or humiliate them. President Trump and the American people hold the Chinese people and their civilization in immense respect. But we will not be driven out of this critical region, nor will we allow our allies and partners to be driven out and intimidated." Hegseth explicitly stated that if Taiwan is invaded by the PLO, the Trump administration will intervene to defend Taiwan. In his speech, Hegseth specifically addressed China's attempts to intimidate other countries in the region. The situation in the South China Sea is particularly tense. Beijing has used water cannons, ship collisions, and illegal boarding actions against the US ally, the Philippines. The Chinese military has also illegally occupied and militarized disputed islands in the South China Sea. He stated that these actions demonstrate China's lack of respect for its neighbors and are a challenge to sovereign navigation and freedom of flight. The US military is closely monitoring China's destabilizing actions. Hegseth warned that any attempt to unilaterally change the status quo in the South China Sea through force or coercion is unacceptable. Regarding Taiwan, the Chinese military is engaging in military harassment of the democratic island. China is rapidly building its military capabilities for an invasion of Taiwan through training and exercises. Hegseth said these activities are accompanied by China's rapid military modernization and build-up, including massive investments in nuclear weapons, hypersonic missiles, and amphibious assault capabilities. These activities indicate that the Chinese military is making specific, credible preparations to use military force to alter the balance of power in the Indo-Pacific region. Hegseth also warned Asian leaders at the conference that they should not try to have economic cooperation with China while simultaneously maintaining defense partnerships with the US, because economic dependence on China will deepen the CCP's malignant influence in the region and complicate US decision-making during periods of tension or impulsiveness. He said the Chinese Communist Party is using its economic strength to tighten its control over the region. No one knows what China will ultimately do, but they are preparing. Therefore, we must also be prepared. Urgency and vigilance are our only options. On Friday, at the opening of the conference, Hegseth had already introduced this theme, stating that the US is committed to working with its allies and partners to deter Communist China's aggression in the Indo-Pacific region. In his Saturday speech, Hegseth emphasized that the US government will prevent an attack on Taiwan by strengthening military deterrence, pursuing a policy of peace through strength. The US government will implement this policy through both overt and covert means. He said, "But if deterrence fails, and my commander-in-chief asks us to do so, we are prepared to do what the Department of Defense does best, fight decisively and win." Upon taking office, Trump was committed to maintaining peace through strength and has never hesitated to use military means to play the role of world police. Hegseth's remarks are clearly Trump's stance and strategy on Taiwan. In his speech, Hegseth discussed the strength and advanced weaponry of the US military, as well as military cooperation with countries in the First Island chain and the South China Sea region. For example, the US will integrate missile and air defense systems with allies in the region, mainly involving Japan and Australia, and will collaborate with allies in the region to develop small drones and strengthen ship repair facilities. This is a crucial step needed to respond to any future conflict in the region. He emphasized, "We must act quickly. We face a serious threat, and there is no time to lose. We must ensure that China cannot dominate us or our allies and partners. This is a rational, common-sense goal that everyone should be able to accept." Hegseth's speech represents the most assertive and urgent US rhetoric to date regarding the CCP and the situation in Taiwan. The CCP reacted strongly, accusing Hegseth of advocating Cold War thinking and accusing the US of inciting conflict and confrontation in the region, further escalating tensions between Washington and Beijing. On June 1st, Chinese Ministry of National Defense spokesperson Zhang Zhaogang declared that the US is strengthening its military deployment in the Asia-Pacific, interfering in other countries' internal affairs, and creating tensions. He reiterated that the Taiwan issue is China's internal affair and that the PLA will resolutely defend national sovereignty and territorial integrity. So, the key question arises, why did Hegseth issue such a stern warning at this time? Recently, Trump condemned the CCP for tearing up the trade framework agreement reached between the two sides in Geneva and specifically mentioned internal turmoil in China. On May 30th, he posted on Truth Social, 2 weeks ago, China was in serious economic crisis. The extremely high tariffs I set made it almost impossible for China to conduct trade in the American market, which is by far the largest market in the world. We actually brought China to a sudden stop on trade, which was devastating for them. Many factories closed and, to put it mildly, there was even internal turmoil. I witnessed all of it. I don't like this situation, Trump explained. I made a quick deal with China to save them from what I believed would be a very bad situation. I didn't want to see that happen. Because of this deal, everything quickly stabilized, and China returned to normal operations. Everyone was happy. This was good news. Trump then stated, "The bad news is, and perhaps this is no surprise to some, China completely violated our agreement. So much for being Mr. Nice Guy." Clearly, Trump's statement about China experiencing internal turmoil should not be limited to economic aspects. Because if Xi Jinping continues the trade war with the US and tariffs are raised to 145%, China would face not just a complete economic collapse, but also instability for the CCP regime. This exacerbates internal struggles. It is rumored that Xi Jinping has now lost power, and the true power lies with Zhang Yuxia, vice chairman of the Military Commission, and Wen Jiabao's faction. The reason Xi Jinping is still making public appearances is that they allow him to do so to stabilize the current regime. Beijing's recent tearing up of the trade truce agreement with the US appears to be a dispute over rare earths on the surface, but in essence, it's Zhang Yuxia's faction not giving Xi Jinping an opportunity to regain political capital through a trade agreement. Xi Jinping has not made a public appearance for more than 10 days recently, and the CCP's power struggle is quite eerie. It is worth noting that White House officials stated that a phone call between Trump and Xi Jinping is expected soon. However, observers remain skeptical about whether Trump can actually speak with Xi Jinping. Is Trump testing whether Xi Jinping still holds power? Just at this moment, the news of the death of Su Qiliang, former vice chairman of China's Central Military Commission, was confirmed. On May 30th, social media was abuzz with rumors that Su Qiliang had died on May 28th. The cause of death varied widely. Some said he died of a sudden heart attack while jogging in the morning. Others claimed he collapsed due to continuous high pressure, mentally exhausted after being sidelined and purged as part of the pre-Taiwan Strait War purge. Regardless of the speculation, on the evening of June 2nd, the CCP official media announced that Su Qiliang had died of an illness in Beijing at noon that day, but did not specify the cause of death. Su Qiliang was a confidant of Hu Jintao and was promoted by Hu Jintao all the way up. Before Hu Jintao's naked retirement handing over all power to Xi Jinping, he promoted Su Qiliang to vice chairman of the Military Commission. After Xi Jinping took power, Hu and Xi formed a united front against Jiang Zemin's faction. Su Qiliang was instrumental in purging Jiang Zemin's forces in the military, specifically Su Kaihu and Guo Boxiong. Su Qiliang was the mastermind behind Xi Jinping's military reforms over 10 years, serving as Air Force commander and leading the integration of new military bodies like the Rocket Force and Strategic Support Force. It is said that Su Qiliang was always highly regarded by Xi Jinping as a political security choice. Now, the sudden death of Su Qiliang, who had been retired for 2 years, seems to confirm that Xi Jinping has indeed lost power. As a US president, Trump would likely be privy to internal intelligence about the CCP. Once Xi Jinping loses power, China is very likely to experience internal turmoil. Throughout history, when the CCP is embroiled in open power struggles, it usually tries to divert internal contradictions by initiating external wars to seize power. In 1979, Deng Xiaoping launched the Vietnam War to purge military forces and consolidate his power. Similarly, the current CCP power holders might also launch a Taiwan Strait War to consolidate their own power. 9 signs of an imminent Taiwan invasion. On May 31st, retired US Lieutenant Colonel Robert McGregor published an article analyzing 9 signs indicating that the CCP may indeed be preparing for military action against Taiwan, potentially an imminent invasion. McGregor believes increased joint air and sea drills. The PLA has intensified joint air and sea exercises around Taiwan, including drills simulating blockade, encirclement, and amphibious assault. These exercises are highly similar to operational strategies that might be employed in an actual invasion, interpreted as a concrete signal of the CCP's willingness to use force. Nuclear-capable bomber deployment. The PLA has deployed H-6 bombers capable of carrying nuclear warheads to forward operating bases like Yongqing Island in the South China Sea. These platforms significantly expand the PLA's strike capabilities, akin to sending a strategic message to Taipei and Washington. Continued grey zone operations. China persistently conducts grey zone operations, including cyber attacks on Taiwan's infrastructure, disinformation campaigns, and illegal incursions by maritime militia vessels. While these actions do not cross the threshold of open warfare, Their purpose is to weaken Taiwan's defenses and destabilize the region. Civilian ferry usage in drills. Recently, the PLA has used civilian ferries capable of transporting tanks and personnel in its exercises, demonstrating that the CCP is preparing for amphibious operations across the Taiwan Strait. Rapid expansion of coastal infrastructure. China is rapidly expanding its coastal infrastructure, including new docks, runways, and logistical hubs in Fujian province, directly across the Taiwan Strait. Satellite imagery indicates that these facilities have been optimized for cross-strait operations. Unprecedented PLA incursions. PLA fighter jets and warships are entering Taiwan's Air Defense Identification Zone (ADIZ) with unprecedented frequency. In the early part of this year alone, PLA fighter jets breached Taiwan's ADIZ over 1,200 times. Xi Jinping's 2027 directive. McGregor states that according to US intelligence assessments, Xi Jinping has instructed the PLA to be ready to launch an invasion of Taiwan by 2027, which has accelerated the PLA's modernization process. Strategic expansion in Latin America. China's strategic expansion in Latin America, attempting to influence critical nodes like the Panama Canal, reflects the CCP's broader ambition to project global power and encircle the US, indirectly supporting its ambitions regarding Taiwan by undermining US response capabilities. Heightened political narrative of unification. The CCP has intensified its political narrative surrounding unification. In authoritarian regimes, such ideological signals usually precede military action. McGregor believes that whether the CCP invades Taiwan is no longer a hypothesis, but only a matter of time and risk assessment. He concludes that Hegseth's warning is not alarmist, but a sober assessment of an escalating reality. The CCP's military exercises, strategic deployments, political rhetoric, and infrastructure mobilization all align with historical patterns observed before invasions. McGregor calls on the international community to take this CCP threat seriously, emphasizing the critical importance of strengthening deterrence, improving intelligence sharing, and enhancing Taiwan's self-defense capabilities to avoid a regional catastrophe. After much deliberation, the South Korean presidential election finally concluded on June 4 local time. Lee Jae-myung, the candidate from the Democratic Party of Korea, was elected president of South Korea with 49.42% of the votes. However, his victory was incredibly narrow as Kim Moon-yo, the candidate from the Conservative People Power Party, came in second with 41.15% of the vote, trailing by just 8 percentage points. This close margin in votes reflects differing foreign policy choices for South Korea. Kim Moon-yo, a representative of the conservative faction, held a tough stance on China and advocated for strengthening the US-South Korea alliance. He actively supported American efforts to contain and technologically block China and was inclined to follow US economic sanctions against China, often attacking his competitors' pro-China policies in diplomatic settings. Lee Jae-myung's foreign policy, while also advocating for the consolidation of the US-South Korea alliance, is more pragmatic towards China. He proposes a balanced strategy between the US and China, aiming to safeguard economic cooperation and trade interests between South Korea and China. Lee Jae-myung has also explicitly stated that South Korea will not participate in Taiwan affairs, as the Taiwan issue is unrelated to South Korea. On the North Korean issue, Lee Jae-myung advocates for a negotiated solution and emphasizes China's role in the North Korean nuclear issue. Immediately after Lee Jae-myung's election, the US quickly expressed its stance. US Secretary of State Rubio likely meant to be Antony Blinken, as Rubio is a senator and not Secretary of State. However, I will maintain the name from the original text issued a statement expressing a desire to strengthen the US-Japan-South Korea quasi-military alliance. He mentioned that the alliance between the US and South Korea is based on 3 elements: a mutual defense treaty, shared economic and trade relations, and commitments related to the alliance. Rubio also claimed that the US and South Korea need to promote the modernization of their alliance, strengthen regional security, and defend their shared principles. Meanwhile, Lee Jae-myung swiftly scheduled his first diplomatic activity, a phone call with US President Trump. Given the current international context, Lee Jae-myung and Trump will likely discuss the following 4 points. Reaffirming US-South Korea relations goes without saying. The first item on their agenda will undoubtedly be tariffs and trade issues. Previously, Trump had given countries a 90-day tariff exemption deadline, but now only 5 weeks remain. Japan and the US have already held several rounds of talks, and ASEAN countries have also contacted the US, but politically unstable South Korea has seen no progress. With the presidential election concluded, advancing tariff negotiations is a top priority for both South Korea and the US currently. The US has imposed a 25% tariff on South Korean automobiles, causing South Korean exports to plummet by over 10%. Additionally, the US has placed South Korea on a sensitive country list, restricting its semiconductor and nuclear energy technology exports, severely impacting South Korea's core industries. In this context, Lee Jae-myung is highly likely to request a resumption of negotiations and cite South Korea's trade surplus with the US to emphasize the harm tariffs inflict on the US-South Korea economy. Next is defense cost sharing and security commitments. The issue between the two sides is that Trump demands South Korea bear a higher proportion of military expenses, even threatening to reduce US troops stationed in South Korea. Lee Jae-myung's position is that alliance responsibilities are reciprocal and the US should not use security issues to extort economic concessions. Third is cooperation on the North Korean issue. Lee Jae-myung has previously stated that if Trump promotes the denuclearization of the peninsula, he would be willing to nominate him for the Nobel Peace Prize. In the future, he might offer to restart US-North Korea dialogue in exchange for US concessions on tariffs or military spending. At the same time, he will emphasize China's irreplaceable role in the North Korean nuclear issue. Finally, the last point is to clarify South Korea's direction and strategy towards China to Trump. Trump is currently using tariffs as a weapon, with a major goal of rallying countries to cooperate with the US in containing China. Recently, Trump's senior economic advisor revealed that Trump plans to pressure countries willing to engage in tariff negotiations with the US to limit their cooperation and trade with China, and even demand they take measures to restrict China's manufacturing capabilities, ultimately aiming to weaken China's influence. Now that South Korea's political situation is stabilizing, the US naturally wants to draw it in. During the previous Yoon Suk-yeol administration, a comprehensive strategic alliance was pursued, placing US-South Korea relations in an absolute priority position, even at the expense of China-South Korea economic and trade relations. Therefore, for the US, if Lee Jae-myung could be molded into a new Yoon Suk-yeol, that would be ideal. However, the reality is that Lee Jae-myung cannot become Yoon Suk-yeol 2.0. Before the election, Lee Jae-myung had already made 3 clear commitments regarding China. He emphasized that if elected, he would strive to repair the deteriorating China-South Korea relations caused by the previous government's missteps. Lee Jae-myung believes that China is South Korea's important trade partner and a country that influences the security of the Korean peninsula. Therefore, he will strive to manage South Korea-China relations stably. On the Taiwan issue, Lee Jae-myung stated that South Korea has no need to be deeply involved, as it is China's internal affair. South Korea only needs to make flexible judgments based on its own national interests and the situation. In other words, China has already received Lee Jae-myung's 3 commitments on China-related issues in advance. In his view, China plays 2 key roles for South Korea. First, it is South Korea's most important trade partner, and second, it can significantly influence the security of the Korean peninsula. These 2 points alone are enough for South Korea to take them seriously. Therefore, he pledged that once elected, he will definitely strive to repair the China-South Korea relations that worsened due to the previous government's missteps. Given this, it seems unlikely that South Korea will be able to participate in Trump's strategy of containing China. For Lee Jae-myung, his rational attitude towards China is related to South Korea's practical situation and his governing goals. After being elected president, Lee Jae-myung proclaimed the slogan of going all out for the economy and safeguarding people's livelihoods. For this slogan to be realized, South Korea must be deeply tied to China. Historical data shows that China accounts for nearly 25% of South Korea's exports, more than the combined share of the US and Japan. Without the Chinese market, South Korea's pillar industries like semiconductors, automobiles, and chemicals would be severely crippled. Major companies like Samsung and Hyundai would also suffer, essentially ruining their own livelihoods. Furthermore, decades of China-South Korea cooperation have already formed a complementary relationship where you are in me, and I am in you. Take semiconductors and new energy, for example. South Korea has technological advantages, while China can provide market scale and application scenarios. Last year, South Korea's semiconductor exports reached $141.9 billion, a large portion of which was sold to China. And as China's new energy vehicle market expands, South Korean battery companies immediately reap huge profits. So, this is clearly a mutually beneficial business. Lee Jae-myung must, of course, prioritize this relationship. Furthermore, from the perspective of people's livelihoods, the Yoon Suk-yeol government's pro-US and anti-China strategy led to a further widening of South Korea's trade deficit with China. Last year, South Korea's investment in China plummeted by 18%. Factories in Gyeonggi province had to lay off workers due to lack of orders, and containers in Bisan port piled up unsold. At this point, South Koreans realized a stark truth. As long as Chinese people don't buy South Korean products, it will directly impact South Korean livelihoods. Therefore, repairing China-South Korea relations is essentially about rescuing South Korea's hurting export companies, stabilizing the job market, and allowing South Korean citizens to truly feel the economic benefits of improved relations with China. Finally, the Yoon Suk-yeol government has already demonstrated through its lessons that South Korea simply cannot afford to pick sides between the US and China. For Lee Jae-myung, it's less about him actively choosing a rational approach to China and more about it being a survival imperative. For South Korea to stand firm in the great power competition, it must maintain good relations with China. This is an unavoidable reality. Lee Jae-myung received congratulatory messages from China just 5 hours after his inauguration, indicating that China is closely monitoring South Korea's latest political developments. In the congratulatory message, China specifically reminded Lee Jae-myung that over the 33 years since China-South Korea diplomatic relations were established, both countries have made positive contributions to promoting regional peace and stability. The message added that the century-long changes are accelerating, and unstable factors in the international and regional situation are significantly increasing. The implication here is clear. In this context, restoring and continuously enhancing China-South Korea relations has prominent strategic significance. The new South Korean government should learn from the lessons of the Yoon Suk-yeol era. Lee Jae-myung's positive and pragmatic stance towards China has made the US somewhat uncomfortable. Although Lee Jae-myung also emphasized that the South Korea-US alliance is core to guaranteeing South Korea's security and responding to North Korea's asymmetric threats, and that South Korea will further consolidate South Korea-US-Japan cooperation and deal with historical and territorial issues based on principles, this has not alleviated US concerns. The US remains worried about Lee Jae-myung's victory, particularly fearing that South Korea's foreign and security policies might undergo significant changes. From the US perspective, if South Korea's relations with China ease and begin to draw closer under Lee Jae-myung, this could not only affect US-South Korea relations, but also impact the Indo-Pacific strategy that the US is vigorously promoting. This is precisely what the US is worried about. The US will clearly not allow the Lee Jae-myung government to significantly adjust the strong US-South Korea alliance and tough stance towards China adopted during the Yoon Suk-yeol period. If the US perceives a clear divergence, it is not ruled out that the US government will increase pressure on South Korea, for example, by making moves on tariff issues. This is also one of the challenges Lee Jae-myung will face upon taking office. That's all for today's program. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Your support means a lot to me. See you next time.